April 9th, 1945. 5:58 in the morning. Staff Sergeant Calvin Price lay chest-deep in canal water, so cold it felt like broken glass against his ribs. The drainage cut ran between two ruined stone bridges north of Bologna, and the mud at the bottom wanted to pull him under with every shallow breath he took. Fog hung over the fields in thick, grey sheets. Somewhere beyond the mist, 3 German artillery batteries had already registered every approach, every sunken lane, every crossing point his division needed to take before sunrise. Calvin was not supposed to be here. 4 days earlier, his battalion commander had banned the method that brought him to this freezing ditch. Banned it in writing. Explicit orders, no exceptions. But 5 enemy spotters were spread across this grid like spiders on a web, hidden in a church belfry, a collapsed rail station, and a vineyard tree line. They had been calling in fire all night, and Calvin had watched stretcher-bearers die in the same brutal patterns for weeks. He knew what happened when men followed the rules against an enemy that did not care about doctrine, so he stopped following them. In the next 3 hours, he would neutralize every spotter on that map using a technique no officer wanted to acknowledge and no manual would ever print. He would do it alone, in the dark, because the cost of waiting for permission was measured in body bags. The first shell of the morning whistled overhead and cracked into a farmhouse 200 yards east. Calvin did not flinch. He just checked his watch, noted the angle, and kept moving through the water like a man who had spent his whole life listening to things that wanted to kill him. Because he had. Logan County, West Virginia, 1933. Calvin grew up in a town wedged between coal seams and freight yards where the hills pressed close and the night shift never really ended. His father worked the railroad switching yards, moving cars by handbrakes in fog and darkness, shouting signals no one bothered to write down because the men who survived long enough already knew them by heart. As a boy, Calvin spent his nights perched on a slag pile behind the yard, legs dangling over rusted iron, watching lanterns swing through the mist. He learned the rhythm of the place before he learned to read. The squeal of a brake wheel that meant a car was rolling too loose. The double clack of a switch that had not thrown clean. The heavy, quick tread of his older brother Danny pounding along the ballast when a job was running behind. Danny was 6 years older, broad-shouldered, and louder than their father ever was. He worked the same yard, same shift, and he had a way of making even the worst nights feel manageable. When Calvin got cold waiting on the slag heap, Danny would toss him his spare coat without a word. When their father came home silent and mean from a bad coupling, Danny would take Calvin fishing until the old man cooled down. Calvin worshipped him the way younger brothers do. On the night Danny died, Calvin heard it coming before anyone else did. He was on his usual perch, shoulders hunched inside Danny's hand-me-down coat, when a single freight car rolled free in the wrong tempo. Not the steady, controlled glide of a brakeman easing it down the grade, but a jagged building rattle that did not belong. Calvin sat up, heart suddenly pounding, knowing something was wrong before the first man shouted. The runaway car came out of the fog like a ghost given weight. It hit an occupied track with a sound Calvin would hear for the rest of his life. Men ran. Someone screamed Danny's name. Lanterns swung wild. By the time Calvin scrambled down from the slag pile, it was already over. He never saw the body. He only saw the broken lantern lying in the gravel and the smear of oil that was not oil at all. After that, patterns were not just interesting. They were survival. Calvin became the kid who noticed when the mine whistle blew a half beat off, when a pulley on the tipple coughed in a way that meant a bearing was going bad. Grown men would shake their heads when he spoke up, then quietly fix whatever he had pointed out. His father never talked about Danny again, but he would squeeze Calvin's shoulder a little too hard whenever the boy walked near the yard, like he was making sure he was still solid and real. When the war came, Calvin enlisted on his 18th birthday without telling anyone. The rail yard had its own uniforms, its own casualties, but Europe felt like the place where the real storm had gone. Maybe, he thought, if he could learn to read the patterns there, he could stop someone else's brother from being crushed by something no one saw coming. At Camp Roberts in California, the instructors noticed Calvin never tripped in the dark. On night exercises, recruits crashed into bushes and cursed at stumps they swore had not been there a second ago. Calvin just flowed through the scrub like he had been born in it. He moved when the wind gusted, stopped when it died, paced his steps to the cadence of other boots, so his own footsteps vanished inside the group. He could tell which way a man was facing just by the sound of his breathing. He knew when someone was watching him, even when he could not see their eyes. The cadre pulled him aside after the third week. "You ever do scouting work, Price?" "Just rail yards, Sergeant." They gave him a pair of field glasses, a compass, and a patrol route that took him into hills where other men got lost. Calvin came back every time with sketches so detailed the training officers thought he had been given a map. He had not. He had just listened, watched, and learned the pattern. By early 1945, he was in northern Italy with the 85th Infantry Division, part of the long, brutal push toward Bologna. The ground was a mess of flooded ditches, plowed fields, and stone farmhouses that looked peaceful in photographs and murderous in real life. German guns were dug into the hills and riverlines, and the problem was not the guns themselves. The problem was the eyes. German artillery spotters were spread across the countryside like sentries on a castle wall. They hid in half-collapsed belfries, in the lofts of barns, in little concrete observation posts disguised as irrigation sheds. They carried binoculars and rangefinders and field phones, and they seemed to see everything. Every time an American company tried to move, shells arrived with brutal accuracy, bracketing crossroads and irrigation ditches and sunken lanes before anyone could dig in. Calvin watched it happen again and again. He watched a rifle company try to cross an open ditch one gray afternoon, men clambering up the far bank with packs heavy from mud and rifles held high. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually make it. Then the first shells fell. 2 rounds short, too long. A quick adjustment. Then the bracket slammed shut right on the line of men, exactly where they had to pass. When the smoke lifted, the ditch was full of bodies, and Calvin could hear one medic yelling for help that would not come. That night, he spread a map on his poncho and traced back impact angles, likely vantage points, possible roof lines. His pencil tapped a church tower, a rail office, a low building near a vineyard. He could not see the spotters, but he could feel the pattern. He knew they were there. The next day, he requested permission to take a small team and hunt them. Major Ellison listened with tired eyes and a jaw that had not unclenched in weeks. Calvin stood in the command tent with his map spread on the folding table, his finger tapping the suspected observation posts he had marked in pencil. Around them, the low murmur of radios and the distant thump of artillery filled the spaces between words. Ellison was a textbook officer, the kind who believed wars were won by following doctrine and maintaining discipline, and Calvin could see the refusal forming before he even finished his pitch. "Scouts observe," Ellison said flatly. "Snipers handle elimination. Artillery handles suppression. We are not assassins choking out observers in their sleep. Sergeant, we are burying men because someone we cannot see keeps calling the range perfect," Calvin answered. Ellison shut it down. Order given. Topic closed. Calvin saluted and stepped back into the rain, feeling the same helpless fury he had felt the night Danny died. He had seen the problem. He had traced the pattern, and no one with the authority to act was willing to do anything about it. A week later, a sniper pair went after a farmhouse attic Calvin had marked on his map. Everyone watched from shallow dugouts as the 2 figures slipped across the low ground, cloaks blending into the winter earth. It was textbook, controlled, professional. A single crack echoed across the field. Someone said they saw a German drop behind the window. Then the adjustment came. Mortars walked a neat, tight pattern straight back along the sniper team's withdrawal route. There had been a second spotter, hidden in the shadow of the chimney, waiting for exactly this. The team disappeared in dust and shrapnel, and the last anyone saw were pieces of their cloaks fluttering down through the smoke. That night, Calvin did not sleep. He sat in a corner of the dugout, listening to distant guns and feeling like he was back in the rail yard, hearing the wrong rhythm and knowing something terrible was coming, but unable to make anyone else react. He thought about the sniper team. He thought about Corporal Ben Hargrove, A medic who had died pulling a wounded man out of a ditch 2 days earlier while shells walked right up his spine. He thought about all the men who had followed every rule and died anyway, and he started to see a different pattern. Spotters did not just look, they followed rhythms. They checked certain sectors more often. They relaxed when their radios crackled, when they leaned in to tune frequencies, when they argued over maps. For a few seconds at a time, their attention was completely elsewhere. Not gone. Just focused so hard in the wrong place that other areas might as well have ceased to exist. Calvin began to test the idea on patrols. Instead of hiding from attention, he started to attach himself to it. He would watch where enemy eyes went, how long they stayed, when they doubled back. He would move only when he knew those eyes were locked somewhere he was not. He slipped to within 80 yards of a pillbox one night, then 60, then 30. On his last patrol, he lay under a broken stone wall so close to a German observer that he could smell stale coffee on the man's breath whenever he leaned out to scan the fields. Each time, he came back with coordinates so precise that Allied guns shredded the positions without losing a single man in the approach. He wrote it all up. Angles, intervals, rough sketches of head movements and radio habits. He sat outside Major Ellison's tent for almost an hour with the report in his hand, forcing himself not to turn around, then finally stepped inside. Ellison read it twice, slowly, his jaw tightening with every page. "You are describing infiltration, not reconnaissance," the major said quietly. "It works," Calvin replied. "It violates the doctrine that keeps my scouts alive. It requires you to get closer to German positions than any regulation allows." "You are too valuable to risk like that, Price." Calvin pointed to the casualty list lying open on the desk, names inked in neat rows. Men who had followed every rule and died anyway. "The doctrine is not keeping them alive," he said. Ellison stood, and for a moment Calvin thought the major might actually listen. Instead, Ellison walked to his field desk, pulled out a blank order form, and started writing. "I am issuing a written order," Ellison said without looking up. "Shadowlink, or whatever you want to call this, is banned. You will not use it, you will not teach it, you will not approach enemy positions inside 100 yards without explicit authorization. Do you understand?" Calvin understood the words. He did not understand how a method that kept men alive could be treated as more dangerous than the fire tearing them apart. But he saluted, took his report back, and stepped into the rain. For 4 days, he obeyed. He watched another platoon stall in shell fire. He watched stretcher bearers go down in the same brutal pattern of bursts, like someone was reading their minds from a hidden perch. Each time the gun spoke, Calvin heard the runaway freight car in his memory, rattling faster and faster, no one moving until impact. On the 5th night, he sat alone in his dugout with his map spread across his knees. He circled 5 positions that his gut told him were feeding the guns that hurt them most. A church tower overlooking the canal. A rail office with broken windows facing the road. A barn near a vineyard. A stone shed by a crossroads. A low dugout near the drainage cut. Allied command was planning a daylight push across open fields at first light. Calvin knew every approach was already registered. He knew men would die in the same patterns they had been dying in for weeks. He thought about Hargrove. He thought about the sniper team. He thought about all the names that would get added to the casualty list if someone did not do something the rules would not allow. At 3:41 in the morning, he packed light. No scoped rifle, no extra gear. Just a carbine stripped to bare essentials, a trench knife, a coil of field wire, 2 smoke grenades, and a pair of captured German field glasses. He did not file a patrol route. He did not tell his squad leader. He just shouldered his pack, checked his watch, and slipped through the gap in the wire. The fog swallowed him whole. Behind him, the batteries waited for first light. In front of him, 5 sets of unseen eyes traced the same deadly patterns they had followed for weeks, unaware that someone who understood patterns better than they did had just stepped into their grid. Calvin moved into the dark without looking back, and for the first time since Danny died, the sound in his head started to shift from the rattle of something out of control to the steady, deliberate rhythm of a man who knew exactly where he was going. The church belfry rose out of the fog like a broken tooth. Calvin crouched in a flooded drainage trench 50 yards out, water up to his chest, watching the tower through the German field glasses he had taken off a dead forward observer 3 weeks earlier. 2 spotters were visible in the opening where the bell used to hang. One held binoculars, the other worked a rangefinder, calling coordinates into a field phone every few minutes. They were good, disciplined. They swept their sectors in overlapping arcs, never leaving a gap, never lingering too long in one place. But Calvin was not looking for gaps. He was looking for the pattern underneath the sweeps. A freight train rumbled somewhere to the north, iron wheels screaming on worn rails. Both spotters turned their heads toward the sound. Just for a moment, just long enough. Calvin moved. He came out of the trench in a low crouch, boots finding purchase on the muddy bank, and crossed 15 yards of open ground while the train noise covered everything. When the wheels stopped screaming, he froze against the base of the tower, pressed flat against cold stone. Above him, the spotters resumed their scan, neither one aware that death had just arrived at their doorstep. He listened. The spotter with the binoculars was talking, low and steady, calling out grid references. The other one was writing, pencil scratching on paper. Every 30 seconds, the field phone crackled and someone on the other end confirmed the data. During those confirmations, both men leaned in toward the handset, heads close together, attention locked on the voice coming through the line. Calvin climbed during the next confirmation. The exterior of the tower was old stone, gaps between the blocks where mortar had crumbled away. He moved hand over hand, boots finding edges, pulling himself up without a sound. Another train howled in the distance, another 30-second window. By the time the spotters finished their next call, Calvin was inside the belfry, knife in hand, standing in the shadow behind them. The man with the binoculars died first, Calvin's hand clamping over his mouth as the blade found his throat. The second spotter turned, eyes going wide, and Calvin hit him hard enough to snap his head back into the stone wall. The field phone was still crackling when both bodies hit the floor. Calvin worked fast. He cut the phone line, then spliced it into a loop using the coil of wire he had brought, rerouting it so any signal from the battery would just echo back into dead air. He left the equipment untouched, the binoculars still sitting on the ledge, the rangefinder propped against the wall. To anyone checking from a distance, the post would look occupied and operational. He dragged the bodies behind the bell housing where the shadows were deepest, then slipped back down the tower and into the fog. 1 down, 4 to go. The ruined rail station was 200 yards east, a gutted building with broken windows facing the road and a collapsed roof that left only the front office standing. Calvin had watched this post for 3 nights running, and he knew the rhythm by heart. 2 spotters. One tracked troop movements near the crossroads. The other watched for artillery flashes so they could call counter-battery fire. The problem was the windows. Both men had clear sight lines in every direction, and there was no cover between the tree line and the station walls. Calvin waited in the brush, watching shells fall in the distance. Every time Allied guns fired, both spotters leaned forward, pressing their faces close to the glass, eyes locked on the horizon where the muzzle flashes bloomed. For 5 or 6 seconds, they were blind to everything below their window line. Calvin moved during the next barrage. He sprinted across open ground in a low crouch, hitting the base of the wall just as the last shell screamed overhead. The spotters were still leaning out, calling corrections, completely unaware. He slid along the wall to the doorway, stepped inside, and crossed the room in 3 strides while their backs were turned. The first man went down without a sound, Calvin's arm around his throat, cutting off air before he could shout. The second spotter spun, mouth opening, and Calvin's knife took him in the chest before the scream could form. Both bodies crumpled. The field phone kept buzzing on the desk. Calvin grabbed the phone, listened to the voice on the other end asking for confirmation, then tapped the handset twice against the desk in a rhythm that sounded like static interference. The voice muttered something annoyed and went silent. Calvin hung up, re-aimed both spotting scopes toward an empty field a half-mile south, then slipped back out into the fog. 2 down, 3 to go. The vineyard outbuilding was harder. It sat at the edge of a tree line with clear sight lines in 3 directions, and Calvin knew from previous observation that this post had 2 men. a primary spotter, and a runner. The runner made periodic trips back to a rear command dugout, carrying written updates when the radio traffic got too crowded. Calvin watched from a collapsed irrigation ditch, counting the intervals between runs. 15 minutes, 20, 18. The timing was irregular, which meant he could not predict the next window. So, he made one. He moved to a ridge a quarter-mile north and used a captured signal flag to flash a pattern that looked like an urgent request for fire adjustment. The flag was positioned just badly enough to seem like it came from a forward unit that did not know proper procedure. Sloppy, amateurish. Exactly the kind of thing a German commander would want clarified in person. 10 minutes later, the runner left the outbuilding at a jog, heading toward the rear dugout. Calvin moved the moment the man disappeared into the trees. He crossed the vineyard in a low sprint, using the rows for cover, and reached the outbuilding while the primary spotter was bent over a map, marking grid squares with a grease pencil. Calvin came through the door fast, knife already moving, and the spotter never got his hands off the table. Calvin smashed the radio's tuning gear, but left it powered so it hummed, sounding normal over the line. He left the door propped open like the spotter had stepped out to relieve himself. By the time the runner came back, Calvin was 200 yards away, buried in a muddy ditch, watching the man walk into the outbuilding and start shouting for help that would not come fast enough. 3 down, 2 to go. The hayloft in the barn was the 4th target, and it almost killed him. 2 observers shared a single heavy set of binoculars, passing them back and forth every few minutes as they swept different sectors. Calvin spent 20 minutes watching from a collapsed stone wall, studying the handoff. Every time one man passed the binoculars, both briefly looked down to avoid jabbing each other with the eyepieces. 3 seconds, maybe 4. It was enough. Calvin crossed the last 40 yards in a series of timed crawls, moving only during the handoffs, freezing between them. He reached the barn, climbed the exterior ladder, and slipped through a gap in the boards while both men were focused on the eastern approach. Inside, the loft smelled like old hay and gun oil. The 2 spotters were positioned near the front opening, backs to the ladder. Calvin used the stacked bales as cover, moving through the shadows until he was close enough to hear them breathing. He waited for the next handoff. When both heads dipped, Calvin moved. He pulled the first man backward into the hay, hand over mouth, knife finding the gap between ribs. The second spotter turned, eyes wide, and Calvin hit him with the momentum of the first body, using the weight to drive them both into the bales. The struggle lasted 5 seconds. Then silence. Calvin dragged both bodies deeper into the loft, covered them with loose hay, and left the binoculars propped on the ledge like the post was still active. 4 down, 1 to go. The camouflage dugout at the drainage cut was the closest position to the front line, and it was the most alert. 2 spotters worked in constant rotation, updating fire missions through a field phone every few minutes. They were dug in tight, with overhead cover and a clear view in every direction. Calvin could not get close without being seen, so he studied when they felt safe. He watched them for 30 minutes from the freezing canal water, noting every movement, every shift in attention. And he found it. During fire corrections, when the battery confirmed receipt and asked for adjustments, both spotters leaned into the dugout, heads together, listening for the confirmation through the handset. For 10 or 12 seconds, they turned their backs to the open side, trusting the overhead cover and the assumption that no one would be crazy enough to get this close. Calvin waited for the next correction cycle. When both heads turned inward, he pulled a smoke grenade, popped it, and lobbed it straight into the dugout entrance. Gray smoke billowed instantly. The spotters started coughing, stumbling, trying to get out. Calvin came through the side opening while they were still blinded, moving fast and low. The first man went down hard, Calvin's boot catching him in the chest and driving him into the dirt wall. The second tried to draw his sidearm, and Calvin's knife took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Both men were on the ground in seconds, choking on smoke and blood. Calvin slashed the phone line, then used the handset to tap a stuttering pattern that sounded like interference caused by a damaged connection. He heard the voice on the other end curse and promised to send a repair team. It would take them 20 minutes to get here. By then, the Allied advance would already be moving. Calvin crawled out of the dugout and into the canal, letting the cold water wash the smoke residue off his face. His hands were shaking, his ears were ringing. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been beaten with a hammer. But all 5 posts were down. He started crawling back toward friendly lines, moving through drainage cuts and irrigation ditches, too exhausted to do anything but put one hand in front of the other. The fog was starting to lift. Somewhere behind him, artillery batteries were waking up for the morning barrage. In a few hours, men would move across fields that had been killing grounds for weeks, and for the first time in a long time, the shells would fall blind. A rear guard almost shot him when he stumbled through the wire. The private had his rifle up, finger on the trigger, until he saw Calvin's division patch and the mud coating him head to toe. He lowered the weapon slowly, eyes wide. "Jesus Christ, Sergeant, where the hell have you been?" Calvin did not answer. He just walked past the guard and kept moving toward the command tent, boots squelching, rifle dragging in the mud. Major Ellison was waiting outside, arms crossed, face carved from stone. Calvin stopped in front of him and spread his map on the ground, 5 positions crossed out in heavy pencil. His voice came out flat and hoarse. "I used what you banned." Ellison stared at him for a long moment, jaw working, eyes cold with fury. Then he turned and shouted for the provost marshal. "Sergeant Price is under arrest for direct violation of written orders. Confine him until charges can be drawn up." 2 MPs moved forward. Calvin did not resist. He just stood there in the mud and blood, watching Ellison's face, waiting for the explosion that was coming. It came 6 hours later. The planned Allied advance began at first light, companies moving across the same fields that had bled them white for weeks. German shells started to fall, but something was wrong. The impacts were scattered, landing behind the lines, onto vacated positions, into plowed earth with no troops present. A company reached a farmhouse that used to be instant death to approach and found it silent. Inside the hayloft, they found 2 dead Germans and a broken radio still buzzing uselessly. Word spread fast. Someone had taken out the spotters. By noon, Calvin's name was circulating in whispers among the enlisted men, passing through foxholes and aid stations like a ghost story that happened to be true. By evening, a courier arrived at division headquarters with casualty estimates for the offensive. The numbers were a third lower than projected. Colonel Merrick, a battle-worn intelligence officer with gray in his beard and scars on his hands, read the report twice, then asked where Sergeant Price was being held. The MPs brought Calvin to headquarters still covered in dried mud, wrists bound, exhaustion written into every line of his face. Merrick dismissed the guards and sat him down at a table covered in maps and after-action reports. "You broke orders," Merrick said quietly. "That is a fact. But in the last 12 hours, our casualty estimates for this offensive dropped by almost a third." Calvin said nothing. He was too tired to defend himself, too numb to care what happened next. Merrick leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "Officially, there will be a court-martial on paper to satisfy the regulations and Major Ellison's insistence. Unofficially, the sentence will be suspended if you agree to teach Shadowlink to a small, hand-picked group." Calvin looked up slowly, processing the words. "You want me to do it again," he said. "I want you to lead others doing it," Merrick replied. "You will not be going alone anymore." They built the team in 3 weeks. Merrick and Calvin hand-picked 8 men from across the division. Scouts who moved quiet. Former hunters who understood patience. A radio man from Brooklyn who could mimic German line noise so perfectly it made officers nervous. A wiry sapper from Chicago who used to crack safes before the war and had hands steady enough to defuse mines in the dark. None of them wanted to be there at first. Calvin trained them at night using mock observation posts staffed by volunteers from support units. He drilled them on listening for attention shifts, moving only when eyes were locked elsewhere, exploiting environmental sounds like carts rattling, church bells ringing, river barges grinding against docks. The first week, everyone got caught in the exercises. Men stumbled, made noise, moved at the wrong time. By the 3rd week, they were ghosting through positions unnoticed. Calvin taught them what he had learned in the rail yards and refined in the fog. That attention had weight and direction. That people did not see everything, they saw what they expected to see. and in the moments when they focused hard on one thing, everything else might as well vanish. He taught them to feel the rhythm of a post, to read the tells in how men stood and breathed and moved, to wait for the moment when eyes were elsewhere and minds were certain nothing was coming. He taught them Shadowlink. Their first official mission targeted a cluster of 4 observation posts near Argenta, all feeding data to a single battery command. Calvin led the team in staggered pairs, each assigned a specific node. They moved through the dark like water through cracks, exploiting every sound, every distraction, every moment when the enemy's attention was fully committed to something that was not them. One pair waited for a low-flying Allied fighter to roar overhead and used the engine noise to cover their approach to a farmhouse loft. Another timed their entry to a villa with the ringing of church bells from a nearby town. A third used the grinding of a German supply truck shifting gears on a muddy road to mask their movement across open ground. All 4 posts went silent within 2 hours. The following morning, a major Allied push met dramatically reduced artillery coordination. Shells fell, but they fell wrong, landing on empty roads and abandoned dugouts. The casualty reports reflected the change immediately. Headquarters could no longer pretend Shadowlink did not work, but success brought scrutiny. General Warren arrived 2 weeks later, a staff officer freshly rotated in from rear headquarters with pressed uniforms and opinions about how wars should be fought. He demanded a briefing on the Shadowlink program, and Calvin found himself standing in front of a map board explaining techniques that made the general's face go red. "This is too close to assassination," Warren said, cutting Calvin off mid-sentence. "We are not training throat cutters. War should be fought openly, with fire and maneuver, not sneaking into dugouts in the dark." Calvin kept his voice level. "The men who died openly under perfect enemy artillery would probably disagree, sir." Warren glared at him. Merrick stepped in before the exchange could escalate, laying out the numbers, the reduced casualties, the tactical advantage of blinding enemy observation networks. The argument went in circles for an hour, regulations versus results, doctrine versus reality. The compromise came with restrictions. Shadowlink teams could only target spotters, forward observers, and artillery fire controllers. No cooks, no sleeping infantry, no rear line clerks. It became a precision doctrine, not a license for night raids. The teams would hunt the eyes that guided the guns, nothing more. Calvin accepted the terms because they were better than a ban, but he knew what the restrictions really meant. The brass wanted the results without owning the methods. They wanted the enemy blind, but did not want to look too closely at how the blindness happened. The war in Italy ground toward its end through April and into May. Shadowlink teams operated across multiple sectors, slipping through German lines, eliminating observation posts, and vanishing before anyone realized they had been there. Internally, they were credited with dozens of destroyed posts and severely reduced artillery accuracy across the front. Casualty rates dropped. Advances that should have cost hundreds of men cost dozens instead. But Calvin received no medal on parade days. His citations were buried in restricted annexes of after-action reports, classified summaries that listed results without naming methods. The teams were acknowledged in whispers among the men who benefited from their work, but official records stayed silent. Command wanted the advantage without the conversation about how it was earned. When Germany surrendered, Calvin went back to West Virginia. He worked for the railroad, married a woman from town named Ellen who asked few questions about the war, and raised 2 daughters in a house 3 streets over from where he grew up. He never talked about Shadowlink. He never talked about the church belfry, or the dugout, or the 5 spotters who died in one night. When veterans gathered at the Legion Hall, he sat in the back and listened to other men's stories without adding his own. But once in a while, he woke up in the night, heart pounding, thinking he heard train wheels and distant artillery blending together into a rhythm that made his hands shake. Ellen never asked what the dreams were about. She just held his hand until he fell back asleep. Decades passed. In 1982, a military historian named Dr. Raymond Kelch was digging through late-war innovations for a book on unconventional tactics in Europe. He found a fragmentary reference in a division intelligence summary, A single line about linked shadow patrols that reduced enemy observation effectiveness in northern Italy during the final offensive. The line had no details, no names. Just a note that certain reconnaissance methods had proven unusually effective and should be studied for future doctrine development. Kelch spent 2 years tracking down veterans who had served in the 85th Infantry Division. Most of them had no idea what he was talking about, but a few, the ones who had been there in those final weeks, started talking haltingly about Price's people, the scouts who walked right up to German posts and made the guns go quiet. One veteran, a former radio operator named Pete Lassiter, still had a letter from his squad leader describing the morning after Calvin's first solo run. 5 observation posts silent, artillery falling blind. An entire sector that had been a meat grinder suddenly passable. "We did not know how he did it," Lassiter said in the interview Kelch recorded. "We just knew that after Price went out, we stopped dying in the same patterns." Kelch found Calvin in 1984, still living in West Virginia, 70 years old and working part-time at the rail yard doing safety inspections. Calvin agreed to one interview, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, answering questions in short, careful sentences. When Kelch asked about Shadowlink, Calvin was quiet for a long time. "It was not magic," he finally said. "It was just paying attention. Everyone has patterns. Everyone looks away sometimes. If you are patient enough and you understand the rhythm, you can move through spaces people think are locked down tight." "Did you ever regret breaking orders?" Kelch asked. Calvin looked out at the rail yard, watching freight cars clank together in the afternoon light. "I regretted every man I watched die because no one was willing to try something the manuals did not cover," he said. "Breaking orders was easier than living with that." Kelch's book came out in 1987. A chapter titled "The Shadowlink Program" reconstructed the technique and estimated that hundreds of Allied lives were saved in the final months of the Italian campaign by blinding enemy artillery observers. Calvin's name appeared in a footnote, then in a chapter heading, finally tied to the method he built and the teams he led. He died in 1991, 2 weeks after his 77th birthday, of a heart attack while walking the rail yard. His daughters found his old maps in a box in the attic, marked with pencil crosses and faded notes about angles and attention patterns. They donated them to the Army Archives, where they sit now in a file labeled Unconventional Reconnaissance Techniques, Northern Italy, 1945. The real lesson of Shadowlink was never about tactics. It was about sergeants and scouts who watched their friends die, recognized patterns others missed, and risked their own careers to break rules that were quietly killing their own men. Innovation in war rarely starts with generals writing doctrine in clean offices. It starts in muddy ditches and freezing canals, with exhausted men who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. Calvin Price understood that before he ever set foot in Italy. He learned it in a West Virginia rail yard, listening to the rhythm of freight cars and watching his brother die because no one heard the pattern shift in time. And when the war gave him a chance to be the one who heard it, who saw it, who moved before the impact came, he took it, even when it cost him everything the army said a soldier was supposed to value. Because some things matter more than orders. Some things matter more than doctrine. And some things, like keeping your brothers alive, matter more than anything else in the world. If you found this story compelling, leave a comment below and let me know where you are watching from around the world. Did Calvin make the right choice breaking orders to save lives? What would you have done in his position? Subscribe to WWII Weapons Vault for more untold stories from the Second World War. These are the moments history tried to bury, the decisions made in darkness that changed everything. I will see you in the next one.